In focus today, the 2017 legislative session in New Mexico. It is a long one, 2 months, and to get us ready, Paul Gessing is here, a regular guest on the program, the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Paul, always good to see you.
Good to be here, Fred.
Good to have you here. So let's start off with the 2016 election before we get into the legislative session, because it's going to have a huge impact. Democrats, of course, retaking control of the House, retaining the Senate, but Governor Martino still has her veto pen.
She does, at least in terms of regular legislation, and the constitutional amendments could circumvent that, but that is something that we're going to all see, the strategy and the level of cooperation in Santa Fe together, and whether there's some agreements or whether it's purely partisan bickering and constitutional circumvention. And of course with the constitutional amendments, though, it's not a done deal. The voters then get their say. So this is true. No, you're absolutely right, and it's a slower process.
Right.
November of 2018 is when we would have the voters given their say on these issues. That's a long delay for some of these issues that may be top priorities.
Now, since you used the word circumventing when describing this process, I'm curious to find out what is your opinion about it? I mean, this is something that is actually, a lot of people are very divided on this, both Democrats and Republicans, who say that constitutional amendments should be only used in very rare circumstance, not just to make sure that something goes through.
Right. Well, love it or not, the constitutional process in this state does avoid the governor's veto pen, and that is going to be something that's attractive for the Democrats who control both houses. Certainly things like PreK expansion and tapping the permanent fund, because of that, that's a constitutional priority, obviously. But you're right, a lot of these other legislative ideas could be done with the cooperation of the governor, and she's likely going to veto perhaps things like a minimum wage increase, certainly getting up above certain levels. There's others that tax increases. I don't know if they can raise taxes through a constitutional amendment, but if they want to get around the governor and she's going to veto it, they may try to do that as well. So a wide variety, marijuana legalization.
And that's the one that's been talked about the most. So I want to ask your opinion, whether it's the foundation's opinion or not, on that one, because there's a really interesting argument that's been made for that to be something to go before voters. And that is, of course, that even if New Mexico, like many other states, passes marijuana legalization, the federal law will not be changing as a result of that. And so the argument is having the people vote on that rather than just the legislature sends a message to Washington and sends a message to the congressional delegation. This is the will of the people, whatever that is.
There's a lot of different issues when it comes to that marijuana issue and the Constitution versus the legislative. Certainly no vote of the people if you do it straight legislatively. Likely the governor vetoes that, but again, the delay in the time period, part of the justification for doing this is the sad state of the budget in Santa Fe, and getting this money coming in, estimated about $50 million annually, delaying that until really the start of 2019 isn't something that I think the Democrats want to see happen. However, strengthening the case is the constitutional amendment with the proviso that the people vote on it, and that shows that support for the issue. So I could see both arguments on that one. The minimum wage, I really don't think that's a constitutional thing, and some of these more run-of-the-mill policies should be kept out of the Constitution, but certainly marijuana is one that I think is a reasonable issue each way.
What impact do you think the shifting politics in Washington will have on New Mexico?
Well, there's a few big ones. Number one is energy. Certainly President Obama was much more enthusiastic about so-called green energy sources, wasn't as thrilled about exploiting energy on federal lands, whether it's coal and a moratorium you had on permitting on coal, the difficulty of permitting on BLM lands, and New Mexico's 40+% federal land. So a lot of the oil and gas companies look at a Trump administration and say, yeah, we're going to be able to go ahead and go get the energy on those federal lands. So that's one shift. The other one is the Clean Power Plan. Now, this isn't as big of a deal here in southern New Mexico, but in northwest New Mexico, San Juan County, they have 2 coal-fired power plants that were kind of being pushed towards oblivion, if you will. They're already shutting down half of one of them, and Trump is probably going to change direction. Now, they probably won't reopen the half that was being shut down, but certainly that's impactful as well. On the flip side, you have the renewable and the clean and the solar and the wind guys, and they're looking at Donald Trump and saying, holy cow, we're going to lose our subsidies and tax credits and all those exemptions and things that have been provided over the years. So energy is a big one. The other one is healthcare and Medicaid. And we've seen Medicaid expansion and the budgetary implications that that's placed on New Mexico and the rapid increase over the next few years of Medicaid expenditures at the state level as we first 5% and then 10% of the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare becomes a state prerogative. What Trump does about Medicaid, block granting perhaps, repealing Obamacare in its entirety, those are some really interesting discussion items, and I don't know what's going to happen.
Right, and they could have a huge impact on the budget because
huge.
Medicaid is already an enormous part of
right.
the budget and would continue to grow if that is not eliminated when apparently the Affordable Care Act is eliminated.
Right, and then of course you have the details of how this is done, because if you block grant, and block grant implies you provide a given set of resources for the state and they have to manage Medicaid. So presumably you have a system where it's more restrained in terms of the states using that money, because quite honestly New Mexico has been taking every dollar they can possibly get from Washington, fleecing the other 49 states, which all the other states try to do the same thing. So it's this mutual game of everybody trying to maximize their federal dollars. Block granting it, I think, would be a very positive thing for both the federal budget, which is relevant, but also long-term patient care, directing resources and giving states the ability to direct those resources to those who are most needy, in need of that kind of medical attention.
Okay, let's move to the budget, because this is the long question, if you will. The Rio Grande Foundation has a number of budget priorities, and the budget is always the big deal. This is what the legislature must do during the session. Even if they get nothing else done,
You're right.
They have to do the budget.
Well, they have to do the budget twice this legislative session, because the special session back in October really didn't adequately address FY fiscal year 2017, which we are currently in the middle of, literally in the very middle of. It ends in June 30th. We're about $70 million short, and we've already used a vast majority, almost all of what I call couch cushion money. It's you find a quarter or dollar bill in your couch, and that's what we've been doing. We did in the special session is we looked for all these funds that hadn't been spent and spent them. Now we're going to have to start making some real tough decisions about what the role of government is, and we've recommended in our report that's available at riograndefoundation.org certain things. We've say we should tackle the branch campus issue and the proliferation of branch campuses. We've talked about film subsidies. Now, all of this is made very difficult by the fact that we're in the middle of this session right now, or this budget year right now. So the ability to make quick changes on a dime is very limited. But of course, we have this budget problem not eliminated in FY17. We're passing a budget for fiscal year 2018, which begins July 1. $300 million is what they're looking at then. So we have at least the time to make some bigger decisions about where we're going. Of course, then you get into the politics. Democrats might not be enthusiastic about cutting some of the spending. Governor doesn't want to raise taxes. So you have, in many ways, irresistible force and an immovable object. Will we, say, have a budget shutdown? I don't know. It's it's going to be a very interesting session.
Okay. The other thing that really ties into the budget that is a priority for your organization and for many people and many legislators is tax reform.
Right.
And I know one of the things that is kind of an overarching principle for your organization is the notion that we shouldn't play favorites. And our big revenue coming from that gross receipts tax has favorites all over it, right?
That's
because
very
it's
true.
got exemptions,
Very true.
Scores of exemptions.
Yeah, and so far this has been a bipartisan discussion. Now, things could go sideways very easily, and when tax reform becomes just tax increases, that's when we jump off of that particular train, so to speak. But right now, Jason Harper, an Albuquerque area representative, a Republican, and Bill McCamley, a representative from right here in Las Cruces, they're leading the discussion, so to speak. And so far, the principles that have been laid out are very reasonable, trying to reduce or eliminate pyramiding. That's taxing and then taxing an activity again, and that makes New Mexico less competitive in manufacturing and some of these economic activities that we want to get into. There's the exemptions and deductions and bringing people and businesses into the tax structure that are not currently there. That's very important. Bringing the rates down and how low you can go within reason, those are the kinds of things that are going to be very interesting. Of course, the food tax issue is kind of this, I would call it a red herring. We don't have a problem organizationally. I don't think anyone should have a problem with across the board taxes at a low level, and lowering those rates is good for everybody. Throw in the fact that a lot of folks are on food stamps at the low income levels, and I really don't think the concern should be over taxing food, yes or no, but how we do an intelligent pro-economic growth tax reform that will create jobs, create economic growth, and squeeze out a lot of these special interest exemptions.
Of course, as you know, reinstituting the food tax, even if you lower the overall rate for the GRT, is a non-starter with many folks. And one of the things that we often don't talk about when we talk about tax reform that I think is important to address is that, you know, if we were to dramatically change the tax to where revenue would drop from the tax, this puts many people in a bind, as is the case in many states which do not have income taxes. Their property taxes rise dramatically. And so folks, particularly on a limited income, many retirees, for example, find they can no longer live in their home. They have to move.
Well, the goal is, and that's of course a very difficult thing in tax policy, because coming up with a tax rate that makes sense in the models versus the reality is a real challenge, and I'm not going to underestimate that.
Right, yeah.
But the idea is to do something that's revenue neutral-ish and long-term, not just long-term, but in the immediate short-term, will generate the kind of business and economic growth that we've so lacked in this state for a long time, in part due to the gross receipts tax, because we have this tax at rates in excess of 7 or even 8%. And the group that it hits the hardest happens to be small businesses and entrepreneurs. It's a long story short, but if you're a big enterprise, you can avoid paying a lot of the gross receipts taxes because you produce an item or you pay on a service. Whereas a small business, you pay an accountant, you pay an attorney, you pay all these various service providers, and they have rates that they're paying on the tax of 7 and 8%. So if we can make this happen in a revenue neutral-ish manner, that will be a fantastic thing for the state moving forward.
Okay, well, they're related to revenue. We've already talked about two of the things that are new, that are likely to come up. I shouldn't say new, but new maybe in the sense of getting something passed: marijuana legalization and the minimum wage. There is another one, though, that, again, you have Democrats and Republicans both who are very concerned about how to do this, expanded PreK.
Right.
And your organization's concerned about this. In fact, we posted one of your columns on expanded PreK, which raised questions not only about how to fund it, which is a big question in New Mexico, but also whether to do it at all, that there's some research that raises real questions about this.
So the dominant discussion on PreK has been, should we or should we not tap the permanent funds, the permanent fund being oil and gas money that's been set aside for various purposes to fund universities, to fund K-12, et cetera. Our concern is indeed, are we getting something that's going to be helpful for New Mexicans moving forward, especially young people, the kids going to school, and we, of course, want to reform K-12 and make that entire system more effective, because we've already got this system in place, and I would like to see some more reforms to bring us at least top-notch within the United States, if not a world-class K-12 system. But
what do you say, though, to those who argue, many educators who argue, that fixing K-12 requires PreK? In other words, students who are better able to enter K-12?
Well, Head Start, for example, is one of those federally funded pre-K programs. Happens that we just saw a new study come out saying that New Mexico has the worst ranked, 50th, in terms of Head Start, our program, because the money comes from Washington, but we ultimately have a lot to say about administering it at the state level. And Head Start has already been a program that repeatedly the Government Accountability Office, their own kind of think tank internally at the federal level, has said the gains from PreK, from Head Start wear off by the time these kids get into kindergarten, first grade, and move through the system. So I just don't see that as being a real argument. I see the system itself that we're already funding, spending billions of dollars a year, needs to be improved. And anyone in that system, or their kid, or as a teacher, I think can understand that there are reforms that can be made to improve it.
All right.
And we're going to work on that.
We'll have to see what happens.
Exactly.
It's very interesting and a controversial issue. Paul, we'll see you at the end of the session for an update. Thank you for being here.
We'll do that. All right. Thanks, Fred.